as you can guess, for our next talk, we have Lori Holt from the Department of Psychology of the Carnegie Mellon University. And Lori, thank you very much also for joining to this talk. And the audience is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for sticking with us on a Friday, whether it's late or early for you. And thanks very much to the organizers for persevering to bring us together online for these great sessions. I'm super pleased to be here to share some of our ongoing work on how listeners track input regularities across speech and how these regularities conspire with prior knowledge to impact perception. So to foreshadow just a little bit, it's possible to construe the line of work I'll share today as statistical learning in the sense that perception is sensitive to structured online distributional regularities and short-term input, and that this learning does not seem to require overt instruction or feedback. But the learning, I'll ask you to keep in mind, is not driven solely by the input regularities. And as you'll see today, it also depends on top-down knowledge about regularities that have been experienced in prior input. And in this way, one could argue is a form of prediction in line with some of the other talks that we've heard in the sessions so far. So at the broadest level, the project is motivated by what cognitive scientists think of as a stability plasticity dilemma. And the issue is simple. It's just that successful behavior is supported by a cognitive or perceptual system that's plastic enough to adapt to short-term input regularities, but yet stable enough so that it's not so influenced by the short-term input that representations reflecting long-term regularities are overwritten. So we've been interested in this question in the auditory domain, where speech perception is a really excellent test bed, because adult listeners have formed relatively stable representations for words and for phonemes that are consistent and that reflect long-term regularities of their native language community. But yet, in everyday listening, there are loads of pressures to remain flexible enough, plastic enough to adapt to input that deviates from these long-term language community norms. For example, in encountering foreign accented speech, dialect differences, even just idiosyncratic speech differences across different voices. We can also add in there, especially in this last year, systematic distortions to typical acoustic speech signal that happen when you're wearing a mask or when you have a head cold. So we've developed a paradigm in which we can model this dilemma in the laboratory. And it builds from the observation that phonemic speech categories, like the difference here between beer and peer, are signaled on multiple acoustic dimensions. And here for ease of visualization, I'm just manipulating two, voice onset time and fundamental frequency, which co-vary to signal beer and peer, or B and P, in American English. So if we present each and every stimulus across this two-dimensional acoustic grid to listeners, and then just simply ask them to report whether they've heard beer or peer, what we see is something that looks like this. We observe patterns of speech categorization that, as you'd expect, vary across this acoustic space. So we can characterize the contribution of each dimension, since we've sampled orthogonally, using normalized regression coefficients. This makes it really easy to visualize that voice onset time here is carrying greater perceptual weight for American English listeners, or said another way, VOT are effectively signaling category membership as BP, although F0, the relative pitch of the voice, is also contributing as a secondary information source. So we can think about these normalized regression weights as an estimate of the kind of internal perceptual weight in the system. Here, listeners are relying more on VOT than F0. So you can kind of consider this approach a behavioral stand-in for quantitative connection weights in the mapping from auditory input dimensions like F0 and VOT to internal category representations for English phonemes like B and P, or lexical representations for beer and peer in a kind of hierarchical computational model. So here you can consider a conceptual model, just a sketch for the purposes of the talk, in which input dimensions influence activation of long-term category representations acquired across experience, and therefore reflecting the long-term distributional norms of English. So these category representations in turn drive activation of lexical or word representations in English. And importantly, these higher level representations are language specific, therefore inherently non-sensory. And due to the bidirectional nature of the connectivity across levels of this model, they provide the opportunity for top-down influence in processing, something we'll return to later. So just to come back to, with this model now in mind, these data can be understood to indicate a stronger connection weight of VOT in driving category level activation to differentiate between category decisions for beer versus peer, driven by the VOT dimension compared to the F0 dimension, although it also contributes to a lesser extent. So more generally, we can use this orthogonal sampling of it like an entire acoustic space to estimate baseline perceptual weights that may reflect long-term experience with input distributions, the statistical regularities across long-term input in a particular language community. So just a brief aside before we come back to the stability plasticity issue. I want to point out, holding this to the side for just a moment, that we shouldn't think of these as inflexible long-term representations. They themselves are also malleable according to context. So here in the green, all we've done is take the identical stimuli plotted in orange to the left and place them in white noise. And what we can observe is that when we manipulate the context in which speech is presented, we observe the effect of the perceptual weight or the diagnosticity of an acoustic dimension in signaling a speech category shifts and it changes. So in the context of noise, categorization of beer versus peer is such that F0 actually contributes more than VOT, whereas in quiet, VOT carries the perceptual weight more than F0. So this is a point we'll return to later in the talk. So hold on to that for just a moment. But now let me return to this stability plasticity dilemma and explain how we manipulate short-term input distributions in the laboratory in order to create an artificial accent, to be able to investigate how the speech perceptual system adjusts dynamically in response to statistical changes in the input. So here, using the same F0 VOT space that we discussed for measuring baseline perceptual weights across an orthogonal sampling, we'll now selectively sample space, shown here in the light yellow, to create short-term distributional regularities in the input. So in this block, only the stimuli highlighted in yellow would be presented. And we're selectively sampling the space to model the covariation of F0 and VOT that's typical of English. Short VOTs robustly signal B, it was the dominant dimension, and they also tend to have lower F0, whereas Ps have longer VOTs and higher F0. So this covariation matches the predictions from long-term representations that would be expected to be built up for American English input. So in a subsequent block, the same participants will experience a distinct sampling of this acoustic space. And we create a short-term statistical regularity modeling a different dialect or an accent, here an artificial accent. So here the VOT and the F0 covariation is actually reversed, so that now short VOTs are paired with high F0s, long VOTs with low F0s. And the short-term distributional change here is especially subtle. These are not large F0 changes. And it's especially subtle because it's experienced across exactly the same voice. And participants are not alerted to the block structure to indicate this change. So we're just going to rapidly and markedly change the short-term input statistics. So you'll recall that VOT carries most of the perceptual weight, and it's most diagnostic of beer versus peer in American English. And as a result, we're going to expect that VOT will guide perception of these exposure trials to robustly signal category identity as beer for short VOT stimuli, labeled here, and as peer for long VOT stimuli. So that the short-term distributional regularities, the dominant input dimension VOT is going to consistently signal the appropriate category, and indeed the word representations built up from long-term experience. But notice though, that in the reverse block modeling the artificial accent, the secondary F0 dimension mismatches expectations from long-term American English experience. And these exposure stimuli are going to deliver our short-term distributional input statistics, and they constitute about 85% of the trials in a block. The remaining 15% of the trials are test trials, and all the data I'll show you today are plotted according to these test trials. Here we hold the dominant cue that signals category membership, VOT, constant and perceptually ambiguous. And we do this to spy on how much listeners rely on F0 in their judgments of whether the sound is beer or peer. And this gives us a behavioral measure of F0 perceptual weight as short-term regularities in speech fluctuate across blocks. So it's important to note here that these stimuli are from the same voice. There's no obvious marker to the regularity shift across blocks, no overt training, and participants receive no feedback. They simply identify these sounds as beer or peer on every trial with a button press. So when the short-term regularity matches the pattern of FOVOT covariation from long-term English experience, listeners categorize the test stimuli differently as a function of the F0, as we'd expect. More peer responses when the F0 is high, more beer responses when it's low, consistent with English input. But look what happens when we rapidly shift the short-term input statistics. These same listeners in the same session rapidly reweight their reliance on F0. When short-term input regularities shift to the artificial accent, F0 is no longer diagnostic of that category identity, and folks aren't using it in order to make their responses to the test stimuli. So the mapping from acoustic input to speech categories is not fixed. Instead, it's dynamic and it's malleable, and listeners appear to be really sensitive to the short-term distributional regularities in the input, and that this is impacting the effectiveness of sensory input in signaling speech categories. So we've referred to this as dimension-based statistical learning. And here, the statistical regularities are being learned within an object rather than across objects, as in like a classic Safran transitional probability statistical learning task. So in the context of considering stability plasticity dilemma, it's interesting to note that this rapid adaptive plasticity is not a complete remapping to accommodate the new input regularity, this reversed correlation. So here on day one, we replicate the downweighting plotted in the prior slide. Here, F0 reliably signals beer peer in the canonical condition and rapidly is downweighted such that it doesn't signal beer peer in the reverse condition. But here we brought the same people back to the lab across 5 days to continue to experience the exposure to the reverse correlation. But across 5 consecutive days of experience, the short-term statistics don't prevail. Now, one might think of this as a fantastic failure of statistical learning. It's a really simple, easy correlation, but learners are not reversing it so that F0 differentially signals beer and peer. Instead, what this seems to mean is that the fingerprints of long-term regularities are persisting. It seems not to be a remapping to reflect short-term distributional statistics, but rather a reweighting to discount the dimension inconsistent with long-term representation. And so to pull this back to the original dilemma, there's some stability in the maintenance of the long-term representation, even in the face of plasticity for the short-term regularities. This reweighting is very rapid and it's highly sensitive to the short-term regularity. Here we're manipulating the proportion of exposure trials that convey the canonical regularity versus the reverse regularity, moving from 100%, the endpoints of the distribution at the bottom, which I've already shown, to modulated across. And what we see is that perception tracks. The degree of downweighting of F0 tracked with the weighted proportion of experience with that artificial accent. So listeners are even able to track simultaneous and opposing short-term regularities that are presented in the same voice. So graph is a bit much, so stick with me and I'll take you through it. They can do this simultaneous tracking provided that the distributions are tagged by some kind of information that allows the system to know which bin an individual item falls within. So in this example, we use videos as a tag. So here, speech stimuli were always in the same voice, and the stimuli that you see plotted as the dots to the right all have the same voice quality. What differs is that the distributions that are plotted in orange are paired with a video of a female speaker, and the distributions that, and they vary from canonical to reverse back to canonical. Whereas the distributions plotted in green are paired with a video of a male speaker, with his distributions varying from canonical and to reverse. So the orange and green distributions plotted here were mixed in a block. So only the video paired with the voice, that same voice throughout, was the information with which to differentially parse the distributions. So by pitting short-term distributions against one another, we're able to ask if participants can track multiple statistical regularities simultaneously. And this also allows us to ask whether an accompanying object, here a video of a face, would facilitate that parse. And so for those of you who logged on yesterday, you may notice a bit of a connection to Pedrick's pairing of objects with regularities to support statistical learning. So, in fact, a single group of listeners hears a mix of these orange and green distributions and categorizes the sounds as beer and peer. And what we see is that their categorization patterns demonstrate that they track the simultaneous and even sometimes opposing distributions in the short-term regularities, so long as there's a video there to guide them in the binning of exemplars by regularity. So participants are quite able to track multiple, even opposing statistics in the input. So these are just a few examples of what the auditory system is able to do with short-term distributional input statistics in order to update and dynamically reweight the extent to which sensory information signals speech categories. And we've observed these effects across distributional regularities and other acoustic speech dimensions and other speech contrasts like vowels, for example. So considering all of these results, the logical question to ask is, what can we say about what might be driving these rapid adjustments to the effectiveness of sensory information in signaling speech? So that's where I'd like to turn next, and I'll come back to this little toy model that I sketched at the beginning. So in this model, input dimensions influence activation of category representations through weighted connections that more or less effectively activate the category representation. These weights are acquired across long-term experience and reflect the long-term distributional norms of English speech. And these category representations in turn can drive activation of the lexical or word representations, and those can also contribute top-down modulation to earlier representations and the weights that they're effectively signaling. So at this point, it's important to note that our work has demonstrated that the effects I've shown you so far are not dependent on word knowledge, even though these category decisions are situated in real English words. And we know this because specifically the downweighting, for example, of F0, generalizes from one lexical item to others. So for example, if an individual experiences the short-term input distributions in the artificial accent only for beer peer, he or she will generalize that downweighting of F0 also for word pairs like bear pear and bill pill. So instead of being lexically specific, all of the action in this learning seems to be happening pre-lexically in the interactions, perhaps between input dimensions and the speech categories. So in the interest of time, I've chosen today not to share all the gory details of the computational model implementation, but to keep this at a high conceptual level. So let me just walk you through some of the ideas we have about how this learning is taking place, and then use the rest of the time to show you a little bit of evidence for that. So in the example we've been playing with so far, the dominant dimension, VOT in the case of signaling beer and peer in clear speech, is going to provide activation of the speech categories that's unambiguous and quite selective for either B or P. When it's a short VOT, activation of B will be strong. When it's a long VOT, activation will be strong. So this activation is going to activate a category that's built up in representation to reflect the long-term input statistics of English. And it's going to provide an implicit prediction of the correlated secondary dimensions like F0. This secondary dimension matches in the canonical block because the F0 VOT covariation matches English, and mismatches in the reverse blocks that introduce an accent through a change in the short-term regularity. So in this way, the internal language-specific acquired representations that are present in the system serve as predictions of expected input. So we hypothesize that when these predictions mismatch the actual input, it generates an error signal that helps to drive rapid reweighting. So in the manner of sensory motor learning driven by a mismatch, this might be considered a form of sensory cognitive learning, whereby the internal prediction derives from a cognitive rather than a motor representation, here a speech category. So let me give you a little bit of evidence that the reweighting is really dependent upon having activation at this category level. So the baseline perceptual weights that we examined early in the talk provide a way to test this hypothesis. And you'll recall VOT is the dominant dimension in quiet, F0 is the dominant dimension in noise. So if we examine categorization of the perceptually unambiguous exposure stimuli, those exposure stimuli that were highlighted in light yellow in the previous graphs, and we look at how those stimuli are signaling category membership in the reverse block, we're expecting that that dominant dimension, VOT versus F0, is going to give you differential activation. And so the accuracy of categorization of these stimuli is a behavioral proxy for the success of differential B versus P category activation. And this is plotted on the x-axis. So we can compare this to the degree of downweighting observed for the secondary dimension on the y-axis. And in this case, it's the difference score between the two test stimuli. And so what we see in each of these cases is a relationship such that the greater the selected activation of category by the exposure stimuli, the greater the downweighting of the test stimuli. So this suggests a relationship between category level activation and in fact differential category level activation as predicted by our model. So in further support of the hypothesis that category level activation drives this perceptual reweighting, we observed that we observe in dimension-based statistical learning. We next asked whether top-down category activation from word knowledge might also be able to drive downweighting. So can we observe these kind of statistical learning effects even when the regularities are not present in the input, they're present implicitly from top-down category activation. So this graph looks confusing because the two panels are identical. And that's because they're identical in the sense of the input, the acoustic input. So to look at this, we eliminated VOT as a driver of category level activation that we've been relying on all the experiments to this point. We set it to a neutral and perceptually ambiguous value. Here it's 10 milliseconds. What this does is it makes the bottom-up F0 VOT information equivalent, totally equal across canonical and reverse conditions. And in this way, we hope to create virtual input regularities from top-down influences. So we do this by placing these consonants conveyed by F0 and VOT in the context of different lexical frames. So this capitalizes on a well-known effects, longstanding effects in speech perception, whereby perceptually ambiguous phonemes are more likely to be heard as completing a real word than they are a non-word. So in the context of ease, listeners will be more likely to hear a P because peace is a word, but beast is not. But in the context of eef, listeners report more B as beef is a word, but peef is not. So this top-down resolution of B versus P category activation may in turn shift the distributions that have such that they have a virtual FO-VOT correlation for the canonical and the reverse blocks respectively. So indeed, here in the reverse, we will beef and this toward peace. And in this way, at though the bottom-up information that's there in the sensory input is identical, the differing distributions are entirely virtual, driven by these top-down effects. And so at the level of our model, this means that the lexical knowledge can selectively activate one of the speech categories. Instead of using bottom-up input to selectively activate, here we're asking whether top-down category activation may also be sufficient to activate these categories and thus drive the perceptual downweighting on the cue that mismatches expectations from those categories. So in this way, lexical feedback is shifting the stimuli to canonical or reverse virtually through top-down means. And indeed, we observed that F0 is downweighted in the categorization of a lexically neutral peak stimuli when top-down lexical information indicates an artificial accent with a reversed F0 by VOT input statistics. Here, this is plotted as a difference score in the percent peak responses across the two F0 test stimuli, with the smaller difference score in the reverse condition indicating downweighting on the artificial accent that's virtually conveyed. So we can conclude that top-down effects from the lexicon do appear to activate category level representations sufficiently to drive reweighting through dimension-based statistical learning. So finally, we have some preliminary evidence from EEG, specifically the mismatch negativity response, that indicates that this learning does not necessarily depend upon an overt category decision and may be likely to influence acoustic dimensions pre-attentively. So here, participants experienced interleaved mini blocks in the context of an EEG session. And we did this because in as much as this experimental procedure is highly sensitive to the short-term distributional input, we need to manage the distributional input for dimension-based statistical learning versus the kind of distributional input that's required to drive a mismatch negativity response in a standard deviant design. So the block here labeled canonical proceeded just as I've described for the previous experiments. Participants actively categorize stimuli as beer or peer in the context of an EEG experiment. These mini blocks were then alternated with a block of passive listening. And during this time, participants only heard the test stimuli differentiated by F0 with a perceptually ambiguous VOT and presented in an 85:15 ratio to elicit a mismatch negativity response, of course, with everything counterbalanced in every which way. So these short blocks alternated 26 times in order to establish enough trials for an MMN measurement, while regularly reintroducing the short-term regularities via the canonical block. And we did the same with the reverse blocks and of course counterbalanced the order across participants. So what we see, and these are the first data to show this, so we'll take this cautiously, but we observe that the identical test stimuli evoke distinct cortical responses. So we have two simple stimuli presented and mismatch negativity is calculated across them. They differ only in F0. It's in a large enough way to evoke a substantial mismatch negativity response. But what we see is that the magnitude of that response is sensitive to the short-term input distributional regularities in which it's experienced, the interleaved canonical versus reverse blocks. So test stimuli varying only in F0 were less well differentiated in neural response in the context of a short-term regularity with an accent, the reverse block, compared to when the short-term regularities mirrored English in the canonical block. So as a result, this is consistent with the downweighting that we see behaviorally. And so this indicates the possibility that early cortical evoked response is sensitive to the dynamic change in perceptual weights across evoked potentials. Complementing this, we've recently observed that passive exposure to the distributional regularities of the artificial accent is also sufficient to evoke downweighting at F0 with dimension-based statistical learning. So in this study, participants hear 8 stimuli that sample either a canonical or a reverse short-term distribution and only respond to the last stimulus. And that last stimulus is always a test stimulus with ambiguous VOT varying in F0, presented as the 9th sound in a sequence. So in one condition, these 8 samples were paired with a picture to potentially amplify lexical activation that we'd shown to assist learning. And in another condition, a single dot appeared to mark the onset of each sound, conveying the short-term distribution. And again, participants responded to the test stimulus presented as the last sound. So we observed for each of these conditions downweighting of the sort that we've seen in all the other experiments. So even passive listening to the input distributions conveying canonical and reverse covariation is sufficient to elicit this downweighting. And an overt category decision doesn't seem to be crucial to this learning. Moreover, downweighting is apparent both with and without support from the lexical items. So in summary today, let me leave you with just a few points to take away from this work that I think resonate especially with the great sessions we've been hearing. So we consistently see that there's rapid tuning of the effectiveness of sensory input in activating non-sensory category representations. What this tells us is that the mapping from acoustic input to long-term knowledge like speech categories is highly malleable, not fixed. Listeners track the evolving statistical regularities of short-term input, and they can do so across multiple simultaneous regularities. This reweighting is exceptionally rapid. In data I didn't present today, we can see it occurring within just 10 experiences of the short-term distributional regularity. And perhaps the most crucial takeaway for this audience today is that the learning is statistical in the sense that it indicates an exquisite sensitivity of the system to the evolving distributions of input. But yet, it differs quite a lot from traditional approaches to statistical learning in a number of ways. Let me emphasize two today. So firstly, it demonstrates a sensitivity to regularities within as opposed to across objects or events. And we've seen many demonstrations over the last talks of traditional tasks where transitional probabilities across items or objects are tracked and perception becomes sensitive to them. Here, instead, we're showing something a little different in that the learning is across sensory input dimensions that they themselves contribute to the recognition of a single object, in our case, a phonetic category. This means that learners are actively tracking input regularities that define unique objects and events, like a statistical learning for perception, for example. And secondly, and perhaps most crucially for this audience, is that though there's no overt training in this type of learning, it's apparent that when and this learning shows up even when there's no overt categorization decision, we see that it modulates early, potentially pre-attentive cortical response. It's also not wholly passive. What's necessary here, and fairly different from classic statistical learning approaches, is that this learning is requiring activation of an internal representation that can guide learning. What differs is that dimension-based statistical learning is driven by an interaction among the predictions from internal representations that respect long-term input regularities and input regularities of the ongoing short-term distributional input that may or may not match these expectations. So in this way, top-down knowledge that the system already possesses and bottom-up input regularities conspire to balance the stability and the plasticity in speech perception, and possibly other domains that involve an interaction of short and long-term regularities as well. So with that, let me turn to thank an excellent team. These are the folks who contributed the most to this particular work. And thank all of you for your attention late on a Friday, and many thanks to the organizers. So should you be interested in the work today, there's a URL and a QR code to the manuscripts I've mentioned. And I'm super happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Lori. Very nice presentation. And actually, personally, I really like that you are fighting against the prior of the participants instead of trying to take it out of the picture. So indeed, we have about 5 minutes for questions. Okay, we have one question from, I'm so bad at reading names, I'm sorry, Davide. Let me open the mic for you.
Hi.
Hi, Laurie. Pretty amazing presentation. I really liked. So I had a question regarding when you used towards the end of the slides, in which in one case you used images and in one case you did not use images. So I was thinking that the F0 seemed to interact in a way, like the F0 weighting seemed to interact in a way that when images were used, it seemed to reverse, which it seemed to kind of reverse, like, and it looked like it was significant too. So is it because it was getting situated with the images, like kind of the top-down effect was getting prominent when we are using images?
Thanks. That's a great question and a sharp eye for noticing that. So I would say that we've definitely thought about that too. This is super new work from the work of a new first-year graduate student, Alana Hodson, and is among the very top of the list of the things she'll be looking at next. So on one hand, it is possible, right? So you could imagine that having this lexical information to definitively tell you whether this is a beer or a peer would only serve to support greater differential category activation. So it's totally in line with expectations. But let me say the caveat, this is just a single sample. One time, all of the other results I've shown you today have been like so thoroughly replicated that I feel really confident in them. So the small difference, and in fact, the crossover there doesn't quite reach statistical significance either. So I would hesitate to over-interpret that at this point, but we'll see if it holds up. It is kind of an interesting possibility that, one of the things that this paradigm is also doing, as opposed to the button press on every trial type of approach that we'd used previously, so you're getting rapid fire distributions. Every trial is a distribution. And so what that means is you're getting many more exposures per unit of time. And so these subjects, it could be that that's just a different way of kind of dosing the experience that might have differential effects. We'll see in Alana's upcoming work.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the answer.
Thank you. We have another question by Emma Ward. You can go ahead and ask.
Hi, Emma.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. It's really interesting. Just coming back to your final point about like the two theoretical camps, did I understand you correctly that you see the main addition of your work to the statistical learning theory is really about the hierarchical nature of predictions? Is that like what you would miss, so to say, from the theory?
Yeah, I think I think a pure statistical learning account would not predict the patterns of data that we see, right? And that, for example, if we were to present these same exact speech stimuli to a listener who didn't have these native language categories, we wouldn't see these kind of dimensional effects. Mm-hmm. So this is really driven by having this internal representation. Now, certainly lots of statistical learning paradigms operate across existing representations, including the original Safran work, right? Those units are units that were existing in the native language. But I think what this brings to the table is that there's an expectation about how the incoming input aligns with other aspects of the input in order to align with long-term expectations. Mm-hmm. And so I see this not as purely unsupervised learning in the sense of passively accumulating distributional regularities that then influence behavior, but rather, as potentially driven by error-driven learning. And part of the reason for that is the remarkable speed of it. These effects are emerging extremely rapidly within a handful of experiences with the reversal in the artificial accent.
Yeah, cool, thank you.
Thank you, Emma.